Welcome to another episode of Nature of Omaha's Wild World of Animals. You guys, if you're younger, you don't know the amazingness of Natures of Omaha. It's man, it was on Saturday mornings, I think. Natures of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. I don't know what made me think of that, just the intro. I think that even predated like Natural Geographic's, not no, I mean not like the actual magazine, but like that was like a Natural Geographic's kind of show. The elephant made me think of that. Hope you're doing well. I should probably redo this intro, but I might stick with it. I want to talk in this presentation about, if you look at the title for this week, it says like mental health and treatment concerns. And I think that's actually a good title for it because it's like, well, we talk about mental health and we talk about treatments and okay, well, why would you throw the word concerns at the end of that? And it's like, well, because, mental health treatments aren't as always all what they're not always what they're made out to be. And it's like, well, if all of us, we're talking about mental health all the time, and it's like this is such a common topic now, and it's like, but mental health's never been worse. And it's like, how does that resonate? And how does, what's happened over the last few years lead to this? And how does that interfere and create concerns with treatment? How do you have treatment when the bombardment doesn't stop? What does being well mean, in such a complicated and in some ways upsetting, in some ways beautiful world? And how can you make a majestic beast like that elephant think that it has no power? You can train its brain. You can't train that elephant's body. That elephant would run us all over. It's like, but if you start when it's young enough, if you start with the little one, if you keep it chained up, and if you teach it that it can't break its chain, and if you teach it that it's small and weak, it'll grow older and it'll grow big and strong, but it'll have a weak, small, in psychology we would say self-concept. And why do we talk about things like self-concept and identity? Well, because those things matter because they shape behavior. It's like you behave from a place of who you think you are and how you think you connect or don't connect with your world. Are you powerful or are you helpless? And as we get into this presentation, you'll see that I'm not just like kind of randomly starting with this elephant example. It's like the only way you can control an elephant is if you convince its mind that it's controllable. If you do not convince its mind that it's controllable, it is a way more powerful creature than you. I'm using that idea metaphorically. These manipulations, these social pressures, let's use a calmer word, influence you based on how strong you are. So how do we get stronger? How do we reduce the influence of the noise around us? How do we actually try to have real sustainable long-term mental health? It's not just like, a meme. How do we do it in a way that's actually a habit, a growth promoting habit, and a intentional perspective during even sometimes very difficult times? An intentional, dedicated habit based on a faith in the human potential, the long evolutionary history of human beings being, if nothing, adapters, people that can change under stress. Your whole physical body, your whole brain, your whole memory system, your whole thinking, your whole use of language, your whole stress response, all of that is a gift from your ancestors from their attempts to deal with their complicated world. And they didn't have to deal with Snapchat and AI and social credit and surveillance. It's like they didn't have to deal with any of that kind of stuff. It's like some of you are going to dig these presentations and some aren't. And I gotta just not worry. It's like I'm going to try to talk honestly in this course. And even if it's my last course, it's like, what are you going to school for? To be broadcast to or to be taught? Right? Because you can Google people's official stances on things. It's like, I thought that school is about actual conversation about actually complex things so that we can wrestle with ideas. That's what university is supposed to be, a place for you to wrestle with ideas so that you come out stronger. It's a training ground. And I think like mental health, it has to be what's the one word that could end the slide? A practice. It has to be a habit. It has to be a commitment. It also has to be something that we're continually re-energizing. It's not like we can just, change our one bad mood and then we're just perfect for forever. And it's like, you wouldn't even want that. So what, you just live on a beach and drink for the rest of your life? It's like, that'd be cool for 2 weeks. But like, what about 2 years or 20 years in? It's like, one of my points today is going to be that meaningful things. It's like, what will sustain you long term? Well, developing some healthy relationships around you, having people you actually care about, having a few hobbies that you find interesting, getting outside sometimes, like becoming more gentle with your own thoughts towards yourself. Number one. All right, let's get into this. I like you students, and it's, again, at the risk of coming off like a little too much or whatever my daughter says, it's like, whatever. I could also be totally shallow and fake. So I guess too much is if that's my critique. But again, it's like, you got to decide your life. It's like, eventually you're going to be done this course. The cat almost just pressed end. I get nervous because he reaches his hand up on that thing, and if he touches escape, it's all over but the crying. But yeah, so you're good people. This is a ranty intro. Let's get into the presentation. So if you just go on, Google and like Google image or whatever, and just, you don't have to do this, but you can take my word for it, or you can test it. If you go on Google image and I'm pretty sure if you search images for this concept of learned helplessness, that you'll find this picture, right? This picture of the pink elephant. Right, but you'll notice something about that pink elephant, right? That pink elephant is tied to what seemingly looks like a small wooden stick and a small piece of rope or twine. Clearly not enough to hold an elephant. That probably wouldn't even hold me. You think that's gonna hold a... Dang, I should have before I started the slide. Okay, pretend you're not watching for a sec. How much does an elephant weigh? An adult male Asian elephant weighs on average 4,000 kilograms. You don't think you can pull 4,000 kilograms? It's like, which is like what? Damn. I gotta restart this slide. How many pounds is that? How much does an elephant weigh in pounds? I know kilograms is like 2.1 or 2. According to Wonderopolis. Okay, 11,000 pounds. A big elephant can be up to 11,000 pounds. Just think about it. Think 11,000 pounds, like, so that's like what, like, what am I doing numbers math that I'm not good at in a recording, but that's like what, 5, 6 cars? You got all that weight. You think a little rope will hold it physically? That rope has no chance of physically holding that elephant. Unless, of course, unless you started when the elephant was way smaller, when that rope did have a chance. If you started with that rope when the elephant was at a size where that rope was strong enough to hold it, and that rope has always been on its ankle. And long ago it learned that that it had no ability to break that rope, that it was helpless against that rope. It had learned that it was helpless against that rope. So much so, and so deeply psychologically, that later it's actually predictive of behavior. Later it's not actually even trying to rip it, even though it could easily, clearly, cleanly rip it. One quick extension of that leg, boom, quickly, like an aggressive soccer kick. But why would it even try? In its brain, it knows there's no chance. It's learned that it's helpless to such a deep core of its mind that why try? And this is where I make the link to depression. That there's a conceptual metaphor here. And this is the concept of learned helplessness. Okay, so I'll give you a definition here. Okay. So now think about this. It's like learned helplessness suggests that individuals can become demoralized through failure to the point that they give up trying. Right now I've reworked this and added some stuff, but this is like, there's elements of this presentation that I use with my Kitchener students about like learned helplessness. I definitely teach them even parts of stuff from this book. Like if you see in the top right, there's some of these concepts are coming from this really good book I'd actually recommend. It's called like Choices, and the subtitle, it's kind of small on my screen, but it's something like a guide for Canadian psychotherapists or something like that. It's a really good book on intro to counseling. And so again, the learned part of helpless is so important, because the learned part of that two-word concept is why the behavior gets affected later. Even when the elephant's not helpless, that elephant could rip that. The idea is we get pushed down so many times that we're not even trying, and so we're acting as if we're pushed down as hard as we've ever been pushed down. And it's because of the they call it breaking a horse. Like, how do you get a horse to sit on its back? To sit on a horse's back is very dangerous for a horse. Horses don't like things on their back. That's why they buck things off. Why? Because their main predators throughout evolutionary history have been things like snakes and large cats. So it's like mountain lions and stuff like that. So having something on its back with exposure to its neck is a lot of trust for a horse. You have to train the fight out of the horse or out of the dog or out of the elephant or out of the human. That people can give up so many times, and oftentimes because of situations that it then actually creates this behavioral, it'd be like a coding error if it was computers, or a mutation if it was genetics, but at a behavior level, I guess you would say a habit alteration towards where the person's now behaving as if they're actually capable of less than they are. And we hear that all the time, but like that, oh, this person's not their full potential. And it's like almost you hear stuff like that so much that you don't even really think what that actually means. But what that actually means is it's the basis of psychology, that there's this and there's this. There's like where you're at and where you could be at, and that sometimes that distance, and hopefully it's like the closer it is, the more we'd say you're like, realizing yourself, or if whatever word you want to use, Maslow. We can be self-actualized, or we can be fully functional with Rogers. Just my cat just jumped down from the ledge onto the desk. No, 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 no. Okay. I think he probably saw that, but he just stepped on the screen. But anyways, he's cool now. The ability of failures to create a psychosomatic behavior habit that continues a pattern and cements a pattern of predictable helpless responses to challenge. They've learned that they can't do it, so they act like they can't. And it's not even like it's a conscious, obviously it's not like a conscious thought through thing. Right? It's like, if you want to look this up further, you could look up Martin Seligman's experiments on dogs. It's, the basis of the learned helplessness theory comes from positive psychology and Martin Seligman, and it's basically the idea of like, and I've probably already talked to you about it, but basically the idea of if you shock a dog enough, it'll stop trying to get away even when it could. Hence the elephant tied to like a piece of rope. And to take this metaphor one other level deep, it's like pink elephants don't even exist. What's your pink elephant? And that's the hardest thing for me to try to explain what I mean. Right, but that the creator of this term, learned optimism, quick edit, the creator of the term learned helplessness, if you look them up, the book's actually called Learned Optimism, right? And the idea is that, well, hang on a sec before everyone gets all down and out. Positive psychology is largely a behavioralist. It's weird because it's kind of a new approach. I wouldn't necessarily say it's behavioralist, but it's behavior conscious, and it comes more out of like the growth psychology of like the Maslows and Rogers and those kind of people. Virginia Satir. But yeah, this idea of like, a huge component of it is how you behave, how you actually take your steps forward. Okay, let's keep going here. I kind of lost my point right there at the end, but. So now this will be, I want to kind of talk about why I'm doing this presentation too, because in a presentation or in a class like this, like I obviously know who you are as students, that you're, most of you, your intention is to go in the direction of like early childhood education and probably teaching at like high school or grade school, and like talk about important roles for the next generation. And it's like, if I can offer a few words, right? And it's like one of the concepts that's important, and this concept comes actually from social work, and I'll give credit where it's due. It's like, this is one of their best ideas around the concept of like, one of psychology's issues is hyper focus on problems, and that sort of makes sense in the sense of like, if you're coming into me and you're saying, I need to make my life better, and I'm like, okay, well, what's wrong? And you're never gonna walk into my room usually, right, and be like, oh, I got this going on in my life, blah blah blah. Or no, okay, let me start that again. Come in, you're like, oh, I need help with my life, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, what's going right? It's like, that seems like the opposite perspective that we would take. We want to jump in as problem solvers. And one of the key ideas of social work, and it's like, if I could summarize the field of social work in a sentence, it's working with the social world. It's a perspective that shifts the focus just from the problems and deficits to the fact that they're actually living in this like dynamic situation. There might be possibilities and capabilities and relationships and resources that exist in the community and in that person's life world, social world, that could actually help pull them out. Like, so say someone's talking to you about like that they're going through like a rough time and all this stuff, and as they're talking to you and explaining their like depression or their current mood disturbance, that they're like talking about all this, or mood disturbance, you know what I mean? They're talking about all these examples and telling you all these things, and then they say like, and I used to like always hang out with my sister and we'd go on these long walks, and but I don't do anything like that anymore, and I don't do blah blah blah, and they keep going, and you're like, well, hang on a sec, back up there. And you said there that like when you were feeling better you were going on these like regular walks with your sister and stuff. Like, is she still in the scene at all? And yeah, she's still in the scene. And like, would it's like, okay, well, as somebody that's a therapist, or even just as a friend or somebody that's just trying to help somebody, it's really important to be paying attention to the little glimpses in the story that might actually point you towards a solution or a potential ally in helping towards a solution that might be hidden in the problem. And that's the strengths approach. The strengths approach isn't some like flowery, like, let's just pretend everything's good and forget your bad things. Let's just talk about what you like and what colors you like. It's like, it's not that. It's like, okay, even in a storm, there's safer places in the house. It's like, that was a weird, I don't know why I said that, but even in, like that, there's even in difficult situations, there's better ways to respond. And the more informed you are on the situation and the resources available and potential, and some of those resources might be money, some of those resources might be things like coaching, like some organizations like Big Brother and Big Sisters, which I think are some of the most important types of services that exist, and amazing places for you to volunteer. If any of you randomly are like looking for that kind of volunteer work, it's great for your resume in terms of showing your ability to work with people. And that's secondary to the fact that it keeps families together, it prevents child abuse. It's one of the most important services that exist. And it's interesting that I randomly brought up Big Brothers Big Sisters, because I do think it is actually a model example of an application of the strengths perspective. It's like there's an incredible power one or two caring good people can have in the life of somebody that's struggling. And so the strengths perspective is in a sentence, it's like shifting from focusing on the problem and just what's wrong to, it's like almost like the example of social work's version of positive psychology, that like, okay, well, and not just in you know what I mean, just in the sense of like, well, how can we actually increase the health of the world around you, sort of recognizing the fact that you're a part of a system, you don't live on an island. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to put these up for you. I have to switch to presenter mode so I can see what the next click does so that I don't go to the next slide. Okay, now I'll come back to big. So the strengths approach, right? And this is kind of like how I'll sometimes, your university students, you've seen concepts defined a million times, where it's like, here's the definition, now here's kind of like the main tenets of it, or the main points, or the key things. It's like, well, this concept I was just ranting on about, sometimes there's untapped. So think of like a tree that's like full of maple syrup, but if it's not tapped, no, you don't get to have delicious pancakes. It's like that tree needs to be properly tapped, and not just tapped and then blah blah blah. Okay, I don't need to go too far with the maple syrup analogy, but like there's strengths that exist that, and some of them are, gotta get maple syrup out of my mind. Just, but some of the, yeah, like that sister that you used to hang out with, that maybe she would be very willing to like dedicate an hour every Wednesday for a walk or something like that. And it's like that might be a lot better than some. It's like sometimes those little changes, especially little changes that you do often, it's like if you want to change your life, focus on the things that you do all the time and change those things. And I've said this to you before, but it's like my personal life, it's like I'm pretty honest with you about this. It's like morning and bedtime routine. It's like the better I get, the healthier I get. Healthier. That's a weird way to say it, but less arguing and all that kind of stuff. It's like the cleaner the morning and the night routines go, because if you think of it as that can reduce the stress of the day, but if you're doing that, that's happens, my morning and night routines, like that's like 365 times a year, right? The amount, that's like, anyways, over 700 times, 730 times. I don't know why I keep forcing myself deep in recordings to do freestyle math. But yeah, just the point of like, since that happened so many times, right? It's like you could be like, oh, I want to go on a really relaxing 2-day retreat. It's like, okay, well that's awesome, and I'm not against that at all. And I think like self-care stuff's super important. It's like, okay, but then that has effect, and there's lingering effects and stuff. But like the big changes are the all the time things. That's what I'm saying, like my routines, because my routines in the morning and night are also centrally tied with my relationships with like all three of my family members, even the cat. So it's like the little things matter. And this is the idea that kind of helped me with that. This will help me pull myself out of this rant. That behavior is purposeful. That like you're doing things on purpose. Like me making that plan of like trying to be smarter about setting up situations so that me and my daughter aren't arguing before bed every day, which is an easy thing to get into as a parent, right? And so like, how do I make that better? And how do we have like our reading time? And then we have like our time where we do stretching, because anyways, my older daughter always she's going through growing pains right now. So we do like a kind of like, she does her dance stretching. And so it's like the more what you do every day matters. You can do it better or worse. And to think that that's not directly connected to your mental health is incorrect, right? This is all based on this deep understanding that people can change, that learned optimism is actually a hopeful, learned helplessness and learned optimism, two sides of the coin, has an inherent, it's both positive and negative. It's yin yang, because just like it believes in your potential to change, so it says there's a trust that you can change, but there's also a belief that you absolutely also could not change, right? Like patterns have the tendency to continue. And that's one of the ideas, is that, I can get into this on the next slide, this idea of secondary gain. But like, and that's where I always come back to the same saying, that like as a human, your big choice is what kind of habits you both copy and and that emerge from you, because we're habit-based creatures. And so the challenge is to develop as healthy and as sustaining of habits as you can. Very focused on CBT, right? So on looking at this relationship between how we're thinking about things and how we're behaving is sort of what I'm saying. Focusing on how we set goals and how we make sense and work through difficult problems, and this idea of trying to like empowerment, or this empowerment's almost like just a different word for trying to increase learned optimism. Come on up. Right? And yeah, just that part of like avoiding labels that emphasize deficits, right? Or just totally focusing on only the problem. It's saying that like that's an aspect of the situation. If you're doing like an analysis of the situation, there's a problems, but then there's also you know, things pushing in the direction of solutions. Okay. Anyways, this will be all for now. I'm gonna keep recording this tonight. Take care, and for you, it'll just seem like the next slide. Okay. Ooh, that's terrible camera angle. All right. We're back for the second aspect. Here we got, oh, I was going to show you a little view of the cat. Knocked over my pens. It's all good. So, we'll see if we can get, I may as well show you now since I knocked everything over. There's Scotty. He's chilling. All right, class mascot. So hopefully you're not watching too close. That's a lot of camera adjustments for the first half, 30 seconds of the slide. All right, Mike, get back on course. What's a secondary gain mean? If you think of this as meaning like, stay over here, buddy. One of the most difficult things about counseling is that you realize that a lot of times people stay in situations and in patterns that are clearly working against them, that are clearly not in their best interest, that are clearly hurting them. And you wonder like, well, why don't you just stop this or leave this person or change this pattern when it's clearly bringing you, maybe health problems, maybe emotional stress, maybe, risk of safety concerns and abuse and things like that. And one of the most important concepts, this comes from like addiction research and also from just, psychotherapy research in general, is that oftentimes people get stuck in things because of the associated benefits. Like maybe you engage in some substance when you're out with the boyfriend and their friends, and it's like, that you shouldn't. I'm not talking about like, I don't know. I'm trying to just make up an example, right? And you're doing something because it's also helping you fit in, and it's also like helping you maybe even bond or have social experiences, and it's fun, and all these secondary gains to the fact that the actual behavior might not be helping. Or maybe we can totally switch examples and say like, maybe it's a relationship that the person has financial dependence, and the person, there's that financial dependence is a massive secondary gain. So again, this is a concept to try to explain the fact of why some people, sorry, he'll chill in a sec, why some people resist change despite obvious pain or loss, right? Because people's problems aren't individually packaged. They're they're messy. And they're messy because they're influenced by all kinds of other things. It's like the reason the person doesn't leave is because if it was simple as just leaving, they probably would. Some of it's the psychological tie. Some of it might be fear of safety. Some of it might be fear of financial ability to protect yourself. Some of it might be fear of financial ability to protect your kids. So it's, and so those are some examples. So then just to go back to my example, I kind of explained the second part first. But like, so I say their secondary gain refers to benefits that people get from their problems, right? That may be like having all these problems. And it's not that people are doing this consciously, like, I want more attention, I'm going to just complain more. But like, to be honest, you even see it with like my kid. It's like if I'm stressed and busy about something and I'm not giving her enough attention, her behavior gets worse and almost demands my attention. You see it with the cat, right? It's like I'm like ignoring the cat, and so all of a sudden the cat's like licking my arm and scratching at me, and like people in I'm resisting saying that humans are like ogres are like onions, but it's like we're complex and we're multi-layered, and we have our experiences and our woes are deeply sewn together. And so sometimes change is threatening, even when it's healthy, even when it's in the right direction. Okay, so I want to look at this change model. I think this is a good first sort of note on this point, right? So I'm about to get into what's called the trans theoretical model, and it's something you've maybe come across before. I would assume, or I would guess you might have. Um, but again, it's like sometimes these models, it's like it depends sort of the teacher that presented it to you and what they were talking about when they presented it and the examples they use. Because I find sometimes there's tremendous value at breaking down things that might even seem straightforward, like this idea, like obviously motivation's a part of therapy, but the concept here, chill for a sec. You know, he's like aggressively grooming his paws. It's like, give the students a break. Motivation initiates and drives the change process, right? That it's our motivation to, or our lack of motivation. And that's actually a central insight if you ever are actually working with someone, or even with yourself, is understanding that, okay, there's going to be good and bad days, and there's going to be good and bad weeks maybe. And how do we prepare and how do we address this motivation question, right? Because often people are gung-ho and ready to go to make changes at the beginning and then lose motivation, or maybe they're not sure and they're insecure about if they can do it at the beginning, and there's this anticipatory anxiety that requires a different type of motivation than like the maintenance kind of motivation or the try again kind of motivation. And you realize that you're really start to have to become an expert at the subtle nuances of motivation, right? And that it's obviously not one thing, that like motivating you to take a new challenge at the beginning of the term, or motivating you to like keep working during these like what you would call dog days of the term, like this like late middle half where everyone's tired and stressed, and it's like, yeah, but that's where the magic lives. It's like if you the harder you work over these next few weeks, that's the difference between students, to be honest, like marks wise and stuff. And it's like that's the 80/20 principle. It's like how you perform in 20% of those key times like dictates so much, right? It's like the Pareto principle, but it's this concept that like, I don't know, I haven't talked about it much, but the guy that raised me, not raised me, that's too strong, but like that I learned martial arts from and stuff, and that actually I live in his house. He died a long time ago, but not that long ago, I guess. But he used to always say that like train hard in the winter, and that was like an old saying, and it's like it seems so simple, but it's not, because what it's really saying is like if you put in work at the times when everyone else is overwhelmed, it's like that's often the difference. And again, I'm just getting ranty, but I'm trying to go on this point of like understanding the nuances of motivation, that's actually key to understanding how to actually initiate any kind of meaningful change with people and have it be successful. Okay, so I'm going to show you this in a few different ways, but if I'll even leave this up for a sec if people want to write this down, because, and you don't have to draw it, although you could draw it. That's a pretty simple drawing, I guess. And what it's saying is, okay, say I have something I want to change. I have some behavior that I want to stop. It's like I could be at very different levels or stages in wanting to stop that, right? I could be at the level where maybe the person I'm dating thinks it's a problem. Maybe my parents think it's a problem, but I'm not even really thinking of it as a problem yet. I'm maybe denying it to myself a bit. I'm in pre-contemplation. I'm not even contemplating, meaning thinking. I'm not even thinking about it. I'm pre-thinking about it. Or I could be thinking about it. Maybe I'm like a smoker and I know that I probably shouldn't, and I'm like kind of stressed by the fact that I do it, but I still like it and I'm not ready to stop, but I'm like aware of, I'm at the contemplation level. Or maybe I'm at the stage where now I'm actually wanting, I'm just gonna use the smoking example because it's just so easy and straightforward to explain the concept, because it's just such a common thing that people have struggled trying to quit. And it's like, well, partially because one of the points I'm going to make is if you misread what part of this stage the person's at that you're trying to help, you're not going to help them. So the person might be at the stage of not even thinking about it yet. Okay, I'll just go a little slower here. So at this stage, people aren't even intending to take action. They're not even aware that their behavior is like a problem, right? So this could be like, say, for example, the person that's like smoking. Let's assume, just like, I'm not trying to make a value judgment, but let's just assume that like we agree that you probably don't want to be smoking 4 packs a day. I'll just go extreme. So it's hard to argue that my example's too mean, right? And then, so, okay, so then let's go to contemplation. So like maybe the person's starting to think about it. And maybe they're weighing all the reasons like, okay, but it, it really does help me in the mornings and it helps me deal with stress. And they're thinking of all the reasons why they want to. And contemplation might mean they're going back and forth. But my point is that contemplation is still way before the action phase. And the reason most therapies don't work is they assume that people are ready to problem solve. Oh, so okay, so you got your problem. Okay, so now what you got to do is you got to go to the store and you got to like buy this patch and you got to do this and you got to do this and this and this, and the person the whole time in their head's like thinking, I'm not even sure if I'm going to do any of this. They're not at the right stage yet. They miss it. The therapist has misdiagnosed the starting point of the person. It's like if you want to say that you care about Carl Rogers and this whole like person-centered, client-centered, what does that actually mean? Well, what it means is not just to understand their individual situations. It means to understand where they're at in their process, to understand how they make sense of therapy. Have they been through therapy before? Have they had a bunch of negative experiences with it? Do they think that, what stage are they at? And then tailoring your method to address that stage directly. Somebody that's not sure if it's a problem yet, you're helping them very differently than somebody that you're trying to help prevent relapse. Okay, so just keep going through the model, right? So at the contemplation level, right? And I hope this helps, right? I'll leave the slides like this. They're a bit more content for you to like leave some time for you to write it down, and then I'll also try to like kind of ramble a bit about it to hopefully, you know what I'm doing, help you understand it. Okay, so then the third stage, preparation. Okay, so now imagine this is just to keep the same example, the person's like, okay, I'm going to try it. Now I'm actually going to try to start doing things like I'm going to buy one of those timed lockers that only opens at certain times a day, and I'm only going to allow myself to pull out 5 cigarettes from the thing per day. And I'm going to start to, you know, first of all, I'm going to buy that thing on Amazon, and then I'm going to make a plan, and I'm going to talk to my wife about it, and I'm going to, you know, this is the preparation stage. You know, people are maybe intending to take action. They may even start taking small steps, like ordering the time box. I don't know, I saw some infomercial for like how to hide your chips in like a thing that only opens at certain times a day. It's like I'd buy that. I'd probably break it on day 2 with an axe. But anyways, I would delete that if this was a little easier to edit. So then the fourth part, the action stage, right? That, okay, so maybe someone's at the stage where they're fed up and they're sick, or maybe they've coughed some blood or something, or maybe they've had some scenario where now they're like, oh man, this isn't like fun and games, and they want to try to change. My point is, like, that person is completely different than the person that's like back and forth of whether they even think it's a problem. And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand what the person-centered, client-centered idea is. Because it's not just the simple idea that it's like, obviously I'm different than you, so you have to treat me different than I treat you, which is how most people would define what client-centered means. And it's like, well, maybe, but it also means like that, how centered are you on that person, not just their personality or their quirks of their individual, you know, idiosyncratic life story, or just whatever, the movie, the film of their life. It's like, no. What is their specific situation, the specific problem they're dealing with it, their specific stage in dealing with it, how they're conceptualizing it, the resources available to move forward, this whole like strengths perspective thing. It's like you realize that, like, yeah, the complexity, it lies in the complexity. And then the last stage is the maintenance, right? That maybe the person's at this stage, and I'm going to talk about it, of like, okay, you're trying to, this is like where I talk about things like the YMCA. You're trying to stop doing drugs. Why do the YMCA, the Young Men's Association of Canada, is that what, no, why, Young Men of Canada Association? Why does that exist? You know, a major reason for like why MCA kind of clubs, and I forget what the American equivalent would be. It's called YMCA too, but although that would make no sense because I don't know what the C would stand for. But anyways, I'm almost 7 minutes into the slide. Let's not care about the origins of the term. But my point is that why have basketball programs from 7 to 11 on Friday and Saturday nights? Well, because those are the hardest times not to drink. those are the hardest times, not those are the times when the urges are the strongest. And so the idea is people have to have behavioral substitutes. And if people don't have behavioral substitutes, it's a lot to ask to have somebody sit on the edge of their bed twiddling their thumbs at 9:30 on a Saturday when all their friends are out, when they're trying not to drink. It's a lot easier to be in a pickup basketball game with a bunch of other people who also aren't drinking because they're doing a recreational sport. It's like those things exist for specific reasons, right? So that's probably my best example of something that's aimed at like the maintenance phase. Okay, so this slide's not super complex, but I just to add quick to your notes, okay, before we keep going. This is just the easiest way to think of it. Pre-contemplative, no intention to change, right? Let's use the smoking example. No need to change examples to complicate it at this point. Pre-contemplative is like not even thinking about changing. Maybe don't even notice there's a problem. Maybe like it's not even on your radar. Contemplative. So now think, okay, so what would be an example of pre-contemplative? Think of like, and this is an extreme example, but it just came to my head. Like think of those old shows, like intervention kind of shows, where like maybe the person's in a scenario where they're in such a terrible pattern that their family members feel like they need to somehow force the issue, even if the person themselves is, doesn't view it as an issue. That's just one example. Or maybe somebody for legal reasons needs to. Right, or maybe somebody has underlying health conditions being caused by their behavior that they're not quite yet aware of yet. Right, so this idea of like, I was going to say this will be a quick slide and I'm already starting to get wordy, but if you just have this idea of pre-contemplative, meaning no intention to change, contemplative, and you can just think of if I'm sitting here being like, the Toronto Raptors have actually been playing pretty good lately and blah, 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 blah. It's like I'm contemplating about the Toronto Raptors, right? So it's like you can just think about it as almost saying like not thinking about it, thinking about it, preparing to do something about it, doing something about it, trying to keep doing something about it and prevent relapse, sustaining change. So this is kind of like the reason I thought that you might find this presentation interesting, right? And I kind of have a couple, I don't even know what I would call them, kind of special presentations. I guess this is one, the self and others, the other one, and these are ones I'm trying to get at this idea of like, because we'll do the textbook courses and we'll do the reflection exercises, and I wanted to, before you, and for a lot of you, this might be your last class with me, and it's like, well, before you move on, it's like, okay, I also spent a ton of time in this like kind of counseling world, and so what are some, and in teaching this kind of stuff, and so like I remember I used to, it was awesome at Conestoga, we used to have, and I think we still do, but I just don't teach this course anymore, but I used to teach an intro to counseling course where we had like counseling rooms and we had observe rooms, so there's cameras and you could like record the session and then you could talk with the students about how we could actually work on the hard skills of counseling, things that people never work on now, right? Like you might read all this stuff about therapy, but like it's a different thing when you're in the room. And being able to have this, what in counseling you call immediacy, like, ability to think on your feet, or like what you would call in like other areas wit, or like WIT, or just like an ability to kind of think quick, and not necessarily that you need to in a therapy session be like thinking quick in that sense. It's like, but you need to be present. Okay, anyways, I'll keep going on this concept. Okay, so with this slide, I'm saying like, so let's say that the person is in this pre-contemplation stage, and like right above my picture there says, no, not me. It's like, that's like the simplest but a kind of decent way to describe it. And when you're so what I'm basically going to be doing is saying, okay, well, on each of the different stages, how you approach them is different. and how you approach them. Again, this is like from the perspective of you as the therapist, or you as the, in Conestoga, we would use the language of because the program I run is called Human Services Foundations, right? So you as the helping professional or whatever, right? Social worker, you as the psychologist, you use your ability to understand that this is a difficult situation with complex emotions, and that of course there's going to be some resistance. I kind of combined 1 and 2 there. So you're using your empathy, your ability to understand the sort of both the emotional and the how they're making sense of it, the cognitive or the subjective aspect of it. And then you're understanding that of course if we're talking about some major change that you're not really ready to, like, of course there's resistance there, and it's not going to help if you're saying it's not a problem. I'm saying it's a problem. It's not a problem. It's a problem. It's like what I'm going to do is I'm going to trigger your defensiveness. It's actually good that people get defensive. That actually shows that they're fighting for themselves. And it's like you have to be careful of triggering that by too much accusing early, right? Again, we're talking about how do you actually like engage people in difficult situations. The whole purpose of this lecture was called intentional or understanding meaningful change, or whatever it was called, right? Like it wouldn't be meaningful change if it was easy. That this resistance or this pushback or this not wanting to change is part of the change process. And a good way to talk about it is by this concept of exploring discrepancies, right? So I say, like, the simplest way I always explain this to my students is like if your name's Anna and I said, Anna, can I borrow $10? And you give me $10 and I say, okay, well, here's your money back, and I give you a 5. And you're like, well, okay, well, there's a $5 difference, $5 discrepancy, right? You probably already know what that word means, but just think about that, right? Well, you said 10 and it's 5. Okay, well, you're telling me that you think that for you to be happy, you want to have relationships like this, and then you're telling me that your relationship's like this. Right, so notice how what I'm trying to do is to show the difference. Like, you're saying that you want a life that's A, but you keep telling me that your life's like B, and those seem different. And exploring that is like a little bit more gentle than saying than jumping into the advice and like diagnosing right away, right? It's like exploring the discrepancies between what they say they want and what they say that they're doing and where that likely is going. Right, and then to provide and encourage clients to like seek feedback, right? And this idea of like starting where the client's at, and that I can only ever help you to the extent that you want to be helped, right? And Carl Rogers was really blunt with that. He said, like, if we're being totally honest, psychology requires, a person. And again, this gets right to the heart of my like biggest beef with psychology, because it's like I shouldn't say psychology needs the consent of the person. I should say real therapeutic psychological interventions that are actually trying to help people require the self-determined involvement of people. Psychological operations can absolutely affect you outside of your consent, but that's a different topic. Okay. Okay, so now let's say that the person has gotten to a place where, is there a 5 yet? Okay, sorry, I just switched the views because I like to actually talk to you with this on like a full screen. So I'm basically just seeing what you're seeing. But then sometimes I don't want to, I've said this a million times, like, right, if I click it and there is no 5, then it switches to the next slide and kind of messes up the recording. But anyways, so say if you got somebody in this stage of, now they're starting to think about the potential issue, right? And they're starting to maybe consider that maybe it is an issue, right? And at this stage, this is like a sensitive stage. This is like a very tactical And by tactical, I mean like you need to be strategic and smart with how you proceed here, because this is also the stage where you're probably most likely to turn the person away, right? Or turn them off of the whole thing. And a failure at this stage can be rough, right? Like, so basically what I'm trying to say is that if you push too hard and start giving advice and problem solving, and you need to do this and you need to do that and you need to tell this person this and then you need to go here and do that, it's like the the person's like little flame inside that's willing to fight for themselves is like easy to extinguish at this stage, and you need to build that flame, not it's like a little bit of air builds the flame, too much air extinguishes the flame. It's like, to use a fireplace example, but you want to nurture that, right? So this is where like supporting the hope and the belief that they can change, this like learned optimism idea, and being like, well, one of the things I say to people is like, this is like my classic go-to line is like, okay, so this is like the best thing to say to your friend if they've ever been dealing with a breakup or something like that, or to yourself, right? It's like when we go through breakups or something. Okay, so imagine I say this to people, and I'll say this in class sometimes, and I forget what context, but it's like if your best friend broke up with their boyfriend, you would never go for coffee with her and be like, um, well, now that that relationship's over, it kind of sucks for you, right? Because now you're going to be single for life, and you'll never find happiness. And this is obviously a huge verdict on like your quality and value as an individual. Where I'm trying to keep a straight face, right? And because obviously you're not going to say that to your friend, but we say that kind of stuff to ourselves. And so we can tell ourselves these messages that when you flip the narrator's voice and say, imagine this is you saying this to your friend, would you ever say that? And it's like, well, no, that's the worst advice I could ever give my friend that went through a breakup, that the breakup is actually a reflection of who they actually are value wise, and that it actually is proof of why they'll never find happiness. It's like, not only is that wrong, and all of human history would suggest that that's not the case, it's like, but we let ourselves tell ourselves those stories. And then the other thing I always bring up is this idea that like human beings, if anything, are creatures that adapt and evolve and get through tough stuff, right? And again, sometimes you're directly challenging or going against some of this learned helplessness. Sorry. So number 3 and 4. So now think about this. It's like I say or is it number 3? You want to ask them about their past experiences with therapy, right? Because maybe they're going to tell you like, okay, well, I was working with these other 2 people, and then once we got kind of started, things got too pushy and I felt overwhelmed and blah blah blah. And it's like, and I didn't mean blah blah blah, but insert a longer story. And you realize, okay, well, okay, if I'm going to try to help you as the therapist, me knowing how other situations went wrong and what some of the things that led to it going wrong were, that's as valuable of information as anything else you're going to tell me. And then maybe you say, okay, and the other time, it worked a bit because the person actually held me accountable. And when we would come in, because the one therapist I had would never ask about what we talked about before, it would always be just ask how I'm doing now. And so it didn't seem like it mattered if I did stuff, because this whole accountability thing actually is really an important variable. But then this other person I was working with, she always would ask how the things I was doing have been going, right? Like we said, we're going to work on more eye contact when we're talking to people, and how has that been this week, and where have you struggled with that? And so I feel more accountable, and that actually helped. It's like, okay, well, that's super important too, right? So you're almost wanting to ask people, because oftentimes you're not the first door that they knocked on. You're wanting to ask people of like when things went wrong. And you're going to hear almost all the time that it's like too pushy too early, right? And again, this is like my central point of this whole presentation, is that almost all therapy aims at level 4, when almost all people seeking therapy are in level 1, 2, or 3. right? So then the last thing, if people are actually at this stage, then they're at the stage of when you start doing things like pros and cons, not in stage one, right? It's not till this. So if you wanted to actually look up, and if again, I want to make this as from the perspective of, I know we all go through stuff. It's like, this is true for when you're future working with people. This is true for when you're maybe trying to help a friend through a tough patch. This is true for when maybe you're in a tough patch. It's for true for when, I don't know, I'm not talking right now. It's also true when I'm in a rough patch, that like going and Googling and downloading what a payoff matrix is. It's really simple. It's basically a pro and con list, but with an extra column. So it's like, okay, well, what's the positives of you doing this thing? But also, okay, so it's like with any decision, there's what happens if you do it, but what happens if you don't? What happens if you do the alternative, but if you don't? So it adds a second layer. So let me give you an example. It's like, okay, well, what is so let's say somebody's in a bad relationship and they're talking about like, well, what are some of the pros of leaving? And these are some of the pros. But if you do that, what are some of the associated negatives? And then if you don't do that, what are some of the associated negatives with that? And it makes you kind of play out both sides, right? So you want to think of this idea of neither side is risk or cost free, is basically what a payoff matrix is you're trying to look at, well, what's the payoff versus the risk? It's like, okay, well, maybe leaving this terrible relationship is going to put risk to me and my kids in the immediate short term, in terms of financial stability, in terms of living arrangements, in terms of maybe lifestyle and routine upset. Okay. And maybe some of the positives associated with not leaving then would be like stability. But then you say, okay, so stability is the pro for staying, but then what are the cons of that? Well, the cons of that are like, continuing to stay in this unhealthy situation. Yeah, so a payoff matrix, it's like, it's amazing because it's a simple thing. It's like a 4-column thing, and it's something that you could sit down with your friend or with yourself or with someone you're working with over coffee. Just go on Google and download a payoff matrix, and if anyone has trouble finding one, I'll just make one for you. Right? It's basically like, what hap you could just say, um, decision A, what's the potential positives of you doing it? What's the potential negatives of you doing it? And then not doing decision A, what's the potential positives? What's the potential negatives? And it's just, again, you're getting people to think through it. The actual piece of paper means nothing. It's the ability to think. Well, it doesn't mean nothing because putting things on paper is incredibly powerful. But the point is the practice of thinking the plan through before it happens. Let the bad idea die so we don't have to. That's the whole reason we have foresight. Okay, so now say the person's at the action stage. Now they're at the stage where, again, sorry, I'm just making sure I don't have another point on this. So now they're at the stage where they're actually ready to kind of get into practical social work, practical therapy, practical. I would assume most people training to get into becoming a therapist would think you would be talking about in a therapy session, right? Like, how are we going to deal with this problem? What are we going to do? Let's make an actual plan and some actual goals, right? So now we're at the stage of like, the person is not only thinking about it, they're actually thinking, okay, like, what if I was, what if I was going to leave this person? Maybe they're already starting to look up resources for like a shelter, or maybe they're already starting to look up for resources for what would happen with the kids in that situation. And or maybe someone's starting to look up, whatever the example is, stuff related to taking that first step, like that lockable jar thing I was talking about earlier, right? So as you start to have some of that initial goal setting or assembling of resources, number 4. And then number 2 and 3, okay, it needs to be this combination of a realistic action plan. Like what we're going to try to do is this and this, and we're going to try to, like, say if it's smoking, we're going to try to understand that if you're smoking, whatever my example was, 4 packs a day, the chances of you going from 4 packs a day to no smokes is almost zero. So, but the chances of you going from 4 packs a day to 3.5 packs a day is actually quite possible. And it really only means about four, it means that instead of every 15 minutes, it's every 23 minutes or whatever. I'm just making up the math, but it's almost like a systematic desensitization in a weird way, where what I'm going to try to do is keep reducing the amount that's the absolute least you can do with, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to create this with this intentional withdrawal. And so I'm just kind of freestyling this, right? But this would, if someone wanted to try this, like, nowadays some again, I don't want to turn this into a discussion about treatment for nicotine addiction, right? I'm trying to just use it as an example. I think you know what I'm saying. Okay, so as the person's trying to do that, though, they might be running into different problems. And as they're running into different problems, they're going to have backup plans, right? And that's what a contingency is. A contingency is like, okay, so what if you're trying not to drink and then all of a sudden you're bored on the weekend and your friends come over and they've all been drinking and they want you to come with them to the club. That's a hard scenario not to drink in if you've always drank in that situation. Okay, well, if that happens, I'm going to remember this, and I'm going to call my sponsor. That's one of the reasons things like sponsors exist, right? It's 100% contingency planning. Well, what if I'm in a situation that stretches my action plan to the point of potentially breaking it? Well, we need to have thought of that in advance. Classic Benjamin Franklin quote, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. I just like that picture of the mouse. He's like gonna go for the cheese trap, and now he's got a helmet on. But again, it's just this idea of how well you're prepared is going to have a substantial impact on the likely success of the action. And this brings us to sort of one of my key takeaways from this. Circle this. This may come up in a future assignment. What is my point? My point is that this is the biggest mistake that people make in psychology. This is the biggest barrier standing between you and the person you're trying to help. That we have a tendency to misread where people are at in the process. Like, if you think about this, I'm saying like 80%. So this is the research from Prochastak is the person that associated with this trans theoretical model, right? This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing we're talking about. And so her research was looking at this idea of like, what makes certain therapies and certain therapists, more specifically, effective. And one of the biggest things is how much the alignment is in line between the approach of the therapist and where the person's at. 80% of clients entering counseling are in stage 1 to 3. So I buried the lead there. That's the main point. The main point is that 80% of people, so 8 out of every 10, 4 out of every 5, basically most people going to counseling are either not really sure how they even think about it yet, they're just starting to think of it as a problem, or they're maybe starting to think of ways that they might start to change, but they're definitely not at the action stage. And almost all psychological interventions that we do with people, from CBT to whatever style, are action-based. Now, a good therapist in CBT is going to be aware of this and going to be focused on these motivational stages too, right? So that wasn't a cheap shot at CBT, but it's a cheap shot at basically a lot of these short, brief therapies, right? That are focused on, doing therapy in 6 sessions, that because oddly the same amount of time that insurers tend to pay. But anyways, the idea is that some of these ideas of brief therapy are, my cynical side is saying, is cost effectiveness, but it's also like sometimes the reality is especially with things, right? Because if you think back in the day, people would do things like psychoanalysis for years, right? So when I'm saying brief therapy, what I mean by that is like, oh, you're going to meet with the person 5 times, once a week for a month and a half, and then you're going to supposedly be better. And that's because your insurance will pay for 6 sessions. Or as a student, you get 8 sessions or whatever it is, right? So if you only get 8 sessions, that's going to put selection pressure on what approach you use. And it's not surprising that cognitive behavioral therapy is the one that they always pick, because that actually makes sense. That's actually probably the most efficient and effective short-term program. So it sort of wins that by default. And it also tends to be effective with a lot of things that people, especially in like students, would be seeking support with, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Like I practice cognitive, like I have training in my background with that. Like I think cognitive behavioral therapy has a lot to say. Right? And a good cognitive behavioral therapist is actually probably also a psychoanalyst. So my critique is more at the I don't even know if I'm making a critique. It's more general, right? It's like, I'll end this slide in a sec because I know it's getting a little bit into deep water, but basically my point is just, this is the most important thing to know about counseling. And this is coming from like my experience, right? And you can take it however you want, but being person-centered in your approach means not just being centered on the person as an individual, but on their process as being individually, subjectively, and objectively experienced. Yeah, let's try this slide again. I did my classic mistake of pressing I was like going on this long rant, and then I like pressed it too many times and it went to the next slide. So let's try it again. I started it, I want to still make this reflection, even though it feels a bit forced doing it a second time, but I wanted to just tell you I did this presentation I think in 3 times, right? Like I started it earlier in the week, and then I recorded some this morning before I went and got the girls, which was at 3 o'clock is when I basically started to wrap up and leave. And now it's like 6:20, and I'm going to do this last part. This is like Thursday. You'll probably be getting access to this either really late Thursday or Friday if all goes well. And but yeah, I was just saying I had a weird last few minutes because the girls just left to go to dance, but before they left, Evie was showing me that on YouTube you can pause and unpause with K, and then you can use as keyboard shortcuts, and then you can use J and L to forward and fast forward. I'm like, and then my 2-year-old called me Mike. I'm like, oh man. In the period of like 5 minutes, I got taught a computer thing from my 7-year-old, and for the first time, kind of, that she like showed me something that I was like, oh, I didn't know how to do that. Like, that's cool. And then my 2-year-old called me Mike, which kind of shocked me, right? Because it's like, it sounded cute and stuff, but it's like, usually I'm dad to her. But, yeah, so I'm just in a kind of reflective mood. And when it comes to this, and don't worry, I know you're all like looking at the time, how much is left, probably because that sounds like I'm gonna get ranty, but this is the essence of counseling, is that once people start to try to make changes, then it's about, well, first of all, coaching, right? And learning how to cheer for the success, and also really recognize and encourage the effort, right? Like, even if the person, like, say like they're not cutting back on smoking as much as they wanted to, but they are a bit, and they're doing some of the strategies, and they bought the timer box or whatever example I was using earlier, and like, so what you want to be doing is, you're as the therapist, you're not expecting that, like, it's not like only 100%. 100% isn't the only passable score. It's like you're wanting to move the train on the right track in the right direction. And so what you're doing is you're continuing the support, recognizing the effort and successes. Then you're dealing with the issues, right? So a lot of it becomes super practical around, like, actually, like, okay, well, I'm trying to stop drinking, but on Thursdays the guys at work always go out, and I've always done that, and it's like it feels weird when I'm not doing it, and it's like, okay, well, I don't know, go out with them and have a pineapple juice, right, or have cranberry juice. It's like you'll one time I was at, this is such a side story, but one time I was at this, I got these tickets through a buddy. I have no idea how we, the long story about how it happened, but we went to this like Raptors VIP event. This was back when guys like Jose Calderon were on the team, if anyone's a sports fan, and Reggie Evans. I remember because we played cards. It was like playing poker with the guys on the Raptors, and I started to notice so many of them were drinking either cranberry juice or pineapple juice because they weren't allowed to drink, I guess, in that scenario. And I actually asked Reggie Evans about this. If you Google who Reggie Evans basketball player is, he's got a beard. He's like a huge dude. I was gonna say, a huge rebounder. Like he's like, I'm getting a little too basketball focused, but fantastic rebounder. Yeah, and he told me that a lot of athletes, if they're out and they don't want to drink, will have cranberry or pineapple juice because a lot of the bars will have that, and it kind of gives you the feel of like you're drinking something that's not just the water, and it's sort of, if you're, so basically the idea is like, and I don't know why I went on so much on that rant, but like my point is that have an idea, right? Who cares about the cranberry juice piece? That was just my point of like, okay, well, if that happens, I'll go and I'll order a cranberry juice, and maybe the first time my buddies will like give me a couple jabs, like not literally punches, but like might be like, we're just drinking like whatever, say something dumb, but it's like by the second or third time, people will like, that joke will be old, and so again, it's like, so that might have seemed like a weird random example, but this is the thing, is at this stage you're actually like tackling real practical problems, and so that's both problem solving and contingency planning, right? Because it's like problem solving is dealing with the situations, and then contingency planning is like almost like using your power of imagination to predict very likely possible situations and what you would do. Because here's why all this matters, because we know the literature and the science is so clear. It's like you act differently when you have a plan than when you don't have a plan. And it doesn't mean that you always do what you want, but it's like when you don't have intention and when you don't have a plan, you're much more likely to get overwhelmed by the power of the situation. And if you're in a situation where if you're in a life point where you're trying not to be overwhelmed by the power of the situation, right? Then the more planned and intentional and crafted your approach to your day-to-day behavioral patterns is, the better. I also wanted to make the note of, I obviously have like, with some of these presentations, I want to push myself a bit, but I also want to try to be like, drop the notes a bit. And as you can tell, I'm like, especially if you took the first term course with me, it was much more like, we're talking about the brain development. We're talking about this like very specific technical stuff. Remember when we talked about like cephalocaudal and proximodistal and these like specific, how the baby grows from head down and from the middle out. Super technical stuff, right? And part of that is just because it's not that like I necessarily want to teach you it's super technical. It's like just to understand that stuff and the conversations around that, we need to understand the language related to that. But as we get into this like older life aspect of the life cycle, and as we start to talk about aspects of like adult development and this whole idea of mental health, some of the teaching becomes a little more experiential, and like, not to just call myself old 900 times, but it's like I say to my daughter, it's like I've had a lot of trips around the sun, and so I couldn't be like beating around the bush more. Relapse prevention is tough. And it's almost impossible without support and a specific plan. And sometimes if you don't have support, your plan is your support. And the the fact that like there's this huge connection between people getting off alcohol and drugs and religious conversion is not surprising at all. That what would almost be needed is a massive perspective reorientation. Right? Because it's like I'm trying to address this, and what I'm saying is like there's a reason why places like AA, like Alcoholics Anonymous, and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, there's a reason why they lean so heavily on religious ideas, and part of it is because if you're at that place of such depth of despair, it's like that language of like hell and trying to redeem yourself is the only kind of language that makes any sense. And it actually gets to the core of some of these perspectives and patterns of thought and emotion. And it's almost like, of course, people can heal in non-religious ways, but it almost needs that combination, because one of the advantages some kind of a religious approaches could have in an ideal, I guess, scenario would be if it was a strong combination of a positive future in betterment vision of the future, and then combined with instruction on daily habit. Right, and so if you could mirror that in a secular setting, I would assume the benefits would be similar. Right, and I say on the slide, assist clients to deal with periodic obstacles, and that's the thing. It's like, why do I have the example of the tightening the screws a bit? It's like, because things need maintenance, right? And especially complicated change, right? And so at this point, yeah, you're just like, at this point, say the person, and again, so now say this goes over for years, and maybe as the therapist, you're meeting like less and less. And when you're meeting, it's more like kind of just check-ins to make sure things are going okay. And have you been dealing with any pressure points sort of on it? And what can we do to sort of address those? Right? Keeping everything running. It's like, it's obviously like a car comparison, but or like a mechanic kind of comparison, but this idea of the upkeep as being important and as being a key part of keeping the train on the right track, or whatever metaphor you want. Success tip. And again, this is something I already said, but I put review and reminder, but just basically saying, like, just to double emphasize this point, that one of the main concepts in this presentation is that to be effective in helping people, you need to understand that different stages in the change process required both different motivational and different uh, both different motivational approaches and different therapeutic intervention approaches, like ways of acting and engaging as the therapist, right? Like sometimes you're trying to almost help them explore discrepancies early on, and then in the action stage you're actually becoming more of a coach, and then you're helping them kind of maintain. So how you're being as the therapist is transforming also in relation to their process and what they need from you within realms, right? Within those kind of 5 stages. And that's why that's a kind of cool model. And that's what I should have said this earlier, trans meaning across, trans theoretical means this applies in all kinds of things. That it's not, I'm applying the trans theoretical model, and it probably applies most directly to things like therapeutic processes, but you'll see people reference it in relation to teams and groups, all kinds of situations. Okay. This is a kind of neat term, and again, some of this stuff becomes, I'll give you a second to write that down. Some of this stuff becomes sort of like the trend or whatever for a while. And then what I notice happens, and you'll notice this too, trends come along, and then it's like the best part of the trend kind of just gets incorporated into what psychology is, and the worst part kind of just eventually fails away. It's like, yeah, motivational interviewing, like if you wanted to take the essence of what the main point the people in this pushing this idea are saying is that, like, if I had to say it in a sentence, it's combining the idea of therapist with the idea of coach and doing it in an intentional way in regards to things like timing. So it's like sometimes the person needs you to be a therapist and sometimes they need you to be a coach. Sometimes they need you to be a therapist, meaning hearing them out, helping them kind of think through things, like all the kind of things you would kind of associate with how a therapist would talk to the person. So like helping them break down the problem, helping them maybe understand it, helping them work through complicated feelings. But then it's like, okay, so then what would the coach be doing? Well, the coach is also like encouraging the effort, encouraging their ability to look long term. It's like if you're coaching, the only coaching I'm doing currently is I coach hood kids. And Kitchener Hood Kicks is it's like the city's soccer program for kids, and it's like because we're kind of in the downtown area of Kitchener, so kind of in the fields near my daughter's school. Anyways, I'm getting too much into this, but Hood Kicks is like the name of the co-ed kids soccer development program, and I teach this year. I coach Team Sunshine. The kids pick the names, but why was I saying that? Oh yeah, it's like if you're coaching that, it's like, well, what's your main goal as the coach? Your job is to both teach skill and teach emotional control. And it's like, actually, yeah, if you really think about it, so much of coaching is teaching how to deal with, even like, because you think, okay, well, what do you mean emotional control? It's like, okay, when things aren't going your way in a complicated game, it's frustrating. When the ball hits you, like this happens with little kids, right? Like ball hits you and all of a sudden it really hurts and you cry kind of in front of people, and it's like then you have to, it's hard to like regain your composure, and like that's like, you want to learn how to coach. It's like coach kids. It's like if you can coach that, that stuff all translates to adults too. It's like so much of how like the emotion of the situation is then carrying over, and if you can kind of help calm that and speak to that and speak to the problem solving, if you can be the coach and the therapist, is what I'm kind of trying to say. And so I would even, and part of this moves beyond even just this concept of motivational interviewing. I'm saying like to you personally, like if you could even take that even further, right? The better you are as a therapist and the better you are as the coach, it's like at some level this combines into this incredibly effective leader that can make transformational change. So that's your goal. Just do that, okay? I'm pretty sure, I'm almost 100% sure I already said this, but the book at the top right called Choices, and it's something like interviewing skills for Canadian counselors or something like that. You'd find it. It's like second Canadian edition or something like that. Um, and really, if you have it in your library, it'd be a good book for you to use if you're, if you're interested in the counseling stuff or if you're doing projects on it. What that book is I would go through it, some of the content. I'm kind of doing a summary of some of the stuff related to, I just kind of pulled whatever, but if you were actually to go through the book, you'd see that it's kind of a step-by-step guide to some of the, what I'm calling hard skills of counseling, right? It's like some of this stuff is hard to practice or just read about and be good at. It's like, how do you deal with an awkward situation, and how do you try to like get the conversation back on track, and how do you, and that kind of is that number three, and how do you roll with some of the resistance, and if somebody's like closing up a bit, and some of that is you can have strategy, but another part of it is once you've done it a few times, it's different. It's like, just think of any of your part-time jobs. Like if you're thinking of some aspect of it that's kind of complicated, and think about if I came over and we sat down for coffee and you explained to me verbally how to do it. It's like I would probably be able to understand most of it, right? But it's like if I just went and did it like 10 times, I'd probably understand it way better. So that's true with counseling too. It's like counseling's absolutely like a physical skill thing. It's like you can have all the right ideas in the world, and if you come down in the counseling interview with the person that comes to seek you to seek support from you, and you sit too close to them and make them feel awkward, it doesn't matter how good of a therapist you are. It's like you need to know how to actually act in the scene, and that's kind of what that book's about. She had the 4 points that I'm going to wrap this up soon, but the use of empathy, right? And again, you're as my students, I want you to always keep in mind empathy doesn't just mean emotional, right? It doesn't just mean like, oh, you feel sad, so I understand you must be sad. It's like, no, it's more complex. More complex. It's this like ability to use your complicated imaginative skills to create almost like a vision in your own mind of what it would be like to be me in a situation. And some of that is what the emotions would be like, but also what, you know, what my thoughts would be like from my perspective if you were seeing the world through my eyes. Through my eyes more than from my shoes, right? From my subjective perspective. And then that it's really focused on this idea of discrepancy. And I want to just say this one last time, right? That like this is one of the most powerful things. It's like your friends telling you that they want to be in a relationship where they feel valued and supported, and they keep telling you that their partner is doing all these things that are the opposite of demonstrating that. And it's like, well, that's a discrepancy, that's an inconsistency, that's an incongruency, that's a lack of things being level. You're saying you want this, and then you're saying you're getting this, and then you're asking me why you're upset. And there's this number 4, there's this, I'm doing this a bit out of order, but number 4, there's this deep belief in what you can do as a therapist is help people get better at specific things. They're having problems dealing with this situation. You can help them problem solve it. You can, help them build their self-efficacy, their confidence at doing specific tasks, and their belief in their ability to do so. The point here is sort of if you get these 4 things, you sort of get the essence of what motivational interviewing is. Like if you went to take like a master's in social work or something, you'd take whole courses on this, right? And you'd be learning like all the different aspects and then practicing it. It's a practice. We think we listen, but very rarely do we listen with real understanding, true empathy. Yet listening of this very special kind is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. Giant of psychology, Carl Rogers, right? The main person behind this whole like person-centered, client-centered, who you are as the therapist, the role I have as a therapist in participating in your change process based on who you are and what you're dealing with and your growth potential, and so that you can become fully functioning. It's like, what's the real secret power? Can you like actually listen and actually be present and actually, it's actually that at the actual root, right? And I just always remind people, just think of if you went to see some therapist and they were even world renowned as the greatest therapist in the world, and while you were talking to them, you felt like they weren't paying attention. Rogers would say that's not only, first of all, what that shows to you is that I don't care and all this kind of stuff, and it hurt your trust and all that. But not only that, it's like obviously you can't do your job the same way. It's like your main job as the therapist is to be present enough that you can be with the person that you're with so that they can use you as a sophisticated helper in assessing something they're dealing with, right? And so the better you are at helping them feel comfortable to present their idea in the most kind of brutally honest way so that you can actually get to the heart of it together. And you don't accept it as your problem. It's not your problem. That's not respecting the person you're meeting with. It's their problem. You're helping them get stronger at dealing with it. That's the essence of therapy. It's interesting because you probably, as like college students, you probably heard about this in high school. You might have heard about this in like your intro to university or whenever about the SMART goals, right? And it's funny because sometimes things are like it's such a simple and clean little acronym that it's like so easy to just be like, oh, I've heard that before, next, and miss the magic that lies within it. That the more specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely, basically saying the more specific, you could just basically use the first word. The more specific your goal, the more likely you're going to achieve it. The less specific, the less likely. If you want to just get in better shape, less likely. If you want to learn to be able to do, 10 push-ups or 25 squats a day, it's like, okay, well, now all of a sudden that's something specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. We could measure your ability to do that over the next month. That's actually something we could turn into an actionable plan. It's like, well, I'm just going to eat better. It's like, that's too vague. It's like, for me, it's like, oh, I'm going to stop trying to have like chips and pop while you watch the Raptors. It's like, I'm going to start drinking, this gross, no, I'm just joking, whatever. My wife likes the sparkling water. I'm trying to switch. But yeah. Right, so my point is that like if my goal is to stop doing something specific like drinking Coca-Colas while I watch basketball, it's like, okay, well that's something I could actually monitor. Like I could literally take notes on how. I'm not going to because I want to still sneak those sometimes, but right, my point is that the more vague the goal, the more it's lost to the winds of time. Whatever that means. I'm keeping the slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's another important thing to just think about, right? And this is actually true in all kinds of things. But I'll use the example, obviously, here of counseling that oftentimes you're dealing with both what are called outcome and process goals, right? So sometimes an outcome goal would be like, say, if I'm the therapist and you're coming to me for therapy and you're dealing with anxiety about something, the outcome goal is to help you get better with that anxiety or help you get a better understanding of the situation so that it's upsetting you less or helping you, with that kind of stuff. The process goals are more around like, okay, so what are we gonna do here? We're gonna meet like once every couple of weeks. We're gonna come in, talk about it. We're gonna kind of go over some things. I'm gonna give you some things to focus on. It's like, what's the process gonna be like? What's our strategy for reaching those outcome goals? So it's almost like, so my point is that like you'll have better results if you kind of understand that in a lot of situations you're doing both these things. Okay, your goals that you want to get into better shape or develop a better relationship. Okay, well, what are your goals and how you want to see the steps to that goal attain, the process? And I think sometimes the point here is that sometimes it's super helpful, especially in complicated therapeutic situations, to separate the two things. So then there'd be like, sometimes it's way more specific, like, say somebody has a history of anger issues and they're coming to you one-on-one for anger management. First of all, now I'm just like stepping into deep waters because there's a whole bunch of issues, because in that scenario you should be definitely in a setting where there's other people. There's interesting discussions to have about what happens when you're doing therapeutic work in more rural settings or at home. But the idea is that if you want to reduce the likelihood of things ever escalating or getting bad or whatever, it's like it's important to have what are called anticipatory contracts or to have process plans in advance. Like one example would be that if the person has a history of violence, that it's very clear from the beginning that if you start to get upset and start yelling and standing up and walking around, that in advance that if that happens, we have to end the meeting, and I'm not going to cause a huge scene about it. We'll just end and wrap up, and we'll still meet next time. You don't have to take it as, because you're addressing like the abandonment fear. What you're saying is that because this is what the sort of the research shows, is that when people enact pre-existing plans, it tends to de-escalate more than just trying to do it in the moment. If you're going to stand up like that, then we're done. We're done. What? I'm paying for this, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's very different than, okay, I'm sorry that I have to do this, but we've pre-agreed to the fact that if you can't sit back down, we have to end. And you signed a contract on this. We're going to let it go. All right, I'm not going to cause a scene about it. We're going to re-meet next time, the same blah, blah, blah. All right, I was freestyling that, so that was obviously not the best job. But my point is that that's it. The power of that to de-escalate is massive. I'm sorry, I keep always making these points, but my brain just thinks like this. It's like, it's also so true with kids. It's like, just like it, the clearer the goal, the more likely you achieve it. The clearer the expectations and the more reasonable the expectations, the more likely people are to respond to them, right? And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So Frankl says, every therapy must, in some way, no matter how restricted, also be logotherapy. And if you remember, logotherapy means like meaning-based therapy or purpose-based therapy, that so often people are swimming in confusion and in chaos and in feeling that they're alone or that they're alienated or that they lack meaning or that they lack connection. And I just wanted to kind of highlight this point that, like, one of the greatest therapists ever also made this point, that don't ever forget how much helping people is helping people find a vision to move forward that matters and that is meaningful and that has purpose for them, because that actually affects the immune system, right? That's Frankl's whole idea of logotherapy. And he's not like, he's a medical doctor. Frankl was a trained doctor. He knew what he meant when he said that it affects the immune system, that actually, like, your humanity, your ability to, because remember, he came up with these ideas while in the concentration camps during Nazi occupied World War II, and he's like coming up with this idea that being a that there's a value in being a true, authentic, good person, and that value is that it actually affects your immune system. Your body responds to that differently than it responds to being parasitic. So it's a cool point, because the point is really that, like, there's a depth to people, right? And that, like, acknowledging that heals them to a degree. Or at least giving, again, it goes all the way back to the elephant picture at the beginning. It's like that elephant has no idea of meaning. If all of a sudden that elephant, like, almost remembered who it was and saw its elephant friend in danger and went and rescued that friend, and all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a sec, maybe I'm like, of course they're isolated, right? Pavlov knew that. Pavlov knew that if he isolated his dogs, they're easier to train. It's hard to train a pack of dogs. Why? Because when they're together, they remind each other that they're dogs. Not trained pseudo dogs. I wasn't planning on saying that Pavlov part. I don't know where that came from. Every therapy must, in some way, no matter how restricted, also be logotherapy. All right, everyone. I hope you found that presentation decent and somewhat interesting, and I hope you have a great week, and we will see you soon. All right. Cheers.